and we host a Send Leads forum, which lots of you are a part of. We know there's often lots of discussion around this, and Philippa, who you'll hear from shortly, has been doing lots of work at CDC on this for many years, so will be giving us a kind of a run through. So I'm just here to kind of host and do a bit of housekeeping. Like I said, there'll be 3 presentations which we are going to record, because there are a few people who've said that they would have liked to have been here but couldn't, so they want to see the slides and the kind of discussion as well. We'll also share slides afterwards, assuming that's okay with Julia and Nuala as well. So I guess for presentations, we'll be slide sharing, so cameras off, and if you can mute yourself, that's fine. In terms of discussion, we're quite a big group, so I imagine we'll go into some breakout groups later on. Cameras on, ideally. If anyone has any access needs, let us know in the chat or as a private message, and we'll do our best to accommodate those. What else do I need to talk about? Yeah, rather than everyone kind of going around saying who they are and where they're from, because there are a lot of us, if you could just pop in the chat now, just your name and your role and what area you're from, so that everyone knows who else is on the call. And I'm going to hand over to Philippa.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you. Right, we just checked that the screen sharing that worked beautifully a moment ago is still working okay. And there, just Anna, just give me a nod that that's working right. Everyone can see that?
It is, I can see it. Hopefully
okay,
everyone else can too.
So the more interesting part of the seminar comes later, when Julia, Katherine and Nuala Finegan are going to talk about developments in Portsmouth and Manchester. This bit, I'm just going to provide a bit of a framework which draws on a survey, a very limited survey that CDC carried out a while ago, and go through the requirements, the regulations, but then more importantly through the reasons why this is a really good thing to do, and a little bit of experience from some recent work we've been doing with in relation to early years with a number of different local authorities. So first of all, then, you know, this ordinarily available provision, and we'll go into names in a bit, but this is a requirement of the local offer, and it sits within that broader set of requirements around the local offer, which of course first of all is to publish a range of content. There's a requirement there for the significant engagement of parents, children, young people and service providers in developing it. And there is that feedback and review function which is expected around everything that's in the local offer. The element that we're going to focus on is this one specific element, usually known as the ordinarily available provision, but as I say, we'll come to names in a minute. And it's the requirement on the local authority to set out what provision it expects schools, early years providers, post-16 providers to make available. It's set out in the regulations. I've put a link in there. It's in one of the schedules to the regulations, and it's actually quite detailed. I'm going to provide you with some of the detail of the regulations. I'm not going to go through all of it though, because there is quite a lot of detail there, and some of the more sort of structural considerations, the important bits that I want to look at with you, if that's all right. So here's a bit from Regulation 53, Schedule 2. So it covers mainstream schools, post-16 providers. It covers relevant early years education. So that is the free offer, the government funded offer in the early years. And it is across a wide range of institutions, including special schools, special post-16 institutions. It's about as well about what's available in pupil referral units, alternative provision academies, and just a reminder, when it says mainstream schools, it includes academies in that, and it includes the arrangements for funding provision and in effect the use of delegated budget. And that's an important part of this this discussion. So it is fundamentally, it's about how the local authority expects a range of providers to use their delegated budget. So there is a lot more detail. It's meant to cover how all of this full range of institutions are expected to identify children and young people with a special educational need or a disability. It's supposed to cover how parents and young people are consulted and involved, how a range of services are secured, and how support is provided at transfer between phases and indeed in preparation for adulthood. It's also expected to cover approaches to teaching, curriculum support, what additional learning support is expected to be available, how progress is assessed and monitored and assessed. It's also, this is one I'd probably come back to, it's expected to include the evaluation of the effectiveness of provision, access to a range of facilities from all of these providers, and activities that are available in addition to the curriculum. So you'll see that it's starting to look much more like a reflection of what's expected in a school SEN information report. And that's an important thing to bear in mind. But just a reminder, before I skip back to the slightly more overarching look at all of this, this is what the local authority is expected to set out. So this has to be done by agreement with all of those different institutions. It is focused on what all these institutions are expected to provide from their delegated budget, and therefore it would be surprising if, for example, it wasn't looked at the schools forum at some stage in its life, or even repeatedly at several stages in its life and in its development. So it is important. It has quite a strategic significance. That's really the point I want to try and make. So let's have a quick look at what the code says. It echoes the regulations, of course, and it must set out in its local offer an authority-wide description of the provision. That's the special educational and training provision it expects to be available in its area. It does also include other areas beyond the local area. The element I want to focus on, because of its strategic importance, is within the local area, but it is expected to cover what's available in other local areas. And it does, in the code, it does talk about it's the information about the arrangements the local authority has for funding children, including agreements about how providers will use any budget that's been delegated to them. So obviously that reflects the differences between early years providers, schools, post-16 providers, but it is essentially, it is focused on what all these different range of providers do with their delegated budget. And here's the bit which is a bit more focused on the process. The regulations are very clear about the content, and indeed the regulations are clear about the process in relation to the wider local offer. But it's important to reflect just briefly what this means for thinking about the ordinarily available provision. So local authorities must involve children and young people and their parents in the planning, publishing and reviewing this element of the local offer, along with the rest of the local offer. And local authorities and their partner bodies and agencies must cooperate with each other in the development and review of the local offer. So important to think about how settings, schools, post-16 provision, how do they all access some of the other relationships that they need in order to make sure that they are making the provision for different groups of children in their setting. There's a reference to relevant early years education there. So why do we think this is so important? Well, the first thing is that it does, this expectation about the provision that's expected to be made available does define the threshold for top-up funding or for an EHC needs assessment and plan. When a local authority decides whether or not a child or young person requires a plan, they have to consider whether the provision to be made to meet the needs of that child or young person could be made from the resources normally available to the range of institutions in that area. So you realise that then if you've already got a good agreement about the provision that is expected to be made available by all those different providers, then this key element is absolutely central to the decision about whether a child or young person needs a plan or not. And of course, it does set out that question about how providers are expected to use their budget. There are some much wider benefits, though. This can provide, this agreement between the local authority and all the providers in its area can provide a really excellent evidence base for improving progress and outcomes. And I think when Nuala talks about the work in Manchester, which is in relation to early years, I think that you'll see that the way Manchester is planning to use the agreement that they're developing between themselves and early years providers, that is very much focused on a quality improvement function as they look to the future. And so that's a really important consideration. It does also help to identify the particular approaches that are proving most effective. So if I just take an example that perhaps in one local area, all reception classes, or all provision for children in reception year are expected to provide an early language development programme, all of that in lowercase letters. And actually, because someone starts using a particular programme rather than another, and there is a consensus that that actually is proving more effective, then you have a way then of agreeing with all of those who are making provision in reception year, that is the one that you plan to adopt now and you expect to make available. Now, of course, there may be training implications for that, but that, if you like, that can be subject to this sort of agreement as well, because it should set out, this agreement should set out what sort of expertise providers are expected to maintain from their side, but it does also set out in other parts of the local offer what the local authority is expected to provide as well. So some kind of agreement about the introduction of something new might be covered either by providers or by the local authority. But there are really important other elements in this agreement, and that is at least in part about the transparency that parents, that everyone has, but the way in which that transparency can actually improve parental confidence. Where parents are involved in the development of the agreement about what is expected to be provided locally, that can lead to a very different working relationship between parents and schools, parents and the local authority as well. If you like, where schools can relatively easily say to a parent, without any of this agreement in place, I think what your child really needs is something that is we can't afford from our budget, but if you go to the local authority, they'll be able to provide it through an EHC needs assessment and plan. Unless you have this agreement in place, it's very easy for schools to pass on that additional provision, the additional cost as well of that provision. Without the clarity. But where there is that good, clear agreement, then the school is more likely to be saying to parents, these are the sorts of things that we could do for your child. We'll try this. Ultimately, if none of this works, we may need to approach the local authority for an EHC needs assessment. So I think that many local authorities that have got this agreement in place do talk about the more appropriate referrals for EHC needs assessments and plans. So that's an important benefit as well. So just a little bit about how different local areas have gone about this. Most of the agreements refer to the 4 broad areas of need. Most refer to different ages and phases, but some are much more finely differentiated than others. Many use the sort of 3 waves model of intervention. It's universal, targeted and specialist, or the old waves from pre-Children and Families Act, so the waves 1, 2 and 3 that we had in the national strategies. And there are some other elements that have endured. These requirements were in place before the Children and Families Act. They were required, they've been required since the SEN and Disability Act in 2001. So these agreements have been in place, some of them for a long time. So there are some elements which are still there about these different areas of activity or strands of action that were in the SEN toolkit prior to the Children and Families Act. So some of them look at assessment, planning and review. Some of them look at grouping for teaching purposes, some of them at the deployment of additional human resources, and some of them at curriculum and teaching methods. And that, as I say, reflects information prior to the Children and Families Act. Then just a little bit more about, there is in many of the documents that have been developed a balance between needs and provision. So if a child has this kind of need, then this kind of provision should be made by the provider. When I say provider, I mean early years providers, schools or post-16 providers. Some of them indeed look at the level of need that qualifies for a particular type of provision. I think some are much more focused on the provision to be made, whatever the level of need, and almost as if this were about how to meet the need for any child where it arises, whether or not they have a special educational need. And indeed, it almost says this is what you provide for any child, but it would almost form part of your process of assessment. Was this provision that you made, did that meet the needs of the child? If not, how did their response demonstrate what they might need instead or beyond what's been provided through what's ordinarily available? And then, of course, there's a whole wide range of different approaches to the level of detail. Some is extremely detailed and some risks being sort of telephone directory type of detail. For those of you who are old enough to remember what a telephone directory is. So some have very big documents, but include a mix of information and resources. Some reduce the sort of overwhelming amount of information by organising by age group, and some, for many local areas, particularly those the more mature examples where documents have already been through several rounds of revision. There is sometimes a shorter document which is widely available, but with a wide range of supporting resources that may not be so widely available, more likely to be available to SENCOs or other specialist groups. Some make reference to the Equality Act and reasonable adjustments and the local authority accessibility strategy. And of course, the code of practice encourages that sort of read across between SEN and disability. And when CDC undertook the survey, which is a few years ago now, most of the local authority sites did focus on schools, fewer on early years. So that I think has probably changed with some of the recent work that CDC's been doing. And at the time, we didn't find any examples of post-16, but that is not necessarily up-to-date information. So I think we need to think about how accessible this information is once we've got it developed and agreed with our local providers and with parents and other agencies. Indeed, you know, sometimes when I was searching the internet for these, it was often I couldn't find the documents, even though I knew they were there. But it goes by all sorts of different names: what schools are expected to provide, ordinarily available provision, reasonable expectations, SEN support, SEN descriptors, descriptors of provision, but it fulfills the same function. And don't forget, it requires that evidence of engagement. Interestingly, that engagement may be very time consuming, and in the work that we've done with local authorities on early years provision, indeed our engagement was over a bit more than a year, and it was the amount of time and effort invested in this was very significant. I think the point I would make is that despite that time and effort, that is the very key to it being widely used and referred to subsequently. So local authorities who did point to the very significant investment being made in this document did also point to the benefits of having done so. I think there are a number of different approaches. I think I've referred to some of the benefits there over what I've said so far. So, for example, making use of this to help in the decision making around EHC needs assessments and plans, also potentially identifying training needs, also planning provision more coherently. But as well, shouldn't perhaps underplay the importance of engagement with a range of agencies involved in supporting local provision. And that function I talked about in relation to Manchester and the early years work, that potential for improving over time. Just very quickly, because I'm aware I've spoken a bit longer than I meant to really, just a little bit about the support that we provided, because I think this might help us to think about the way we want to structure the discussion when Julie and Nuala have also spoken. So CDC worked with 5 different local areas over a period of about a year, but actually in the end 15 months, if you like, with a sort of follow-up check on progress, if you like. But that was very much in the light of this support was planned in the light of a local action plan with a priority given to developing this aspect of local provision. And it was, whilst we talked about the local offer, it was this element of the local offer we were focused on. It was important that in each of the local areas where we worked, that we took stock of what was in place already, because people almost invariably said, oh, they had something. Yes, they had something, they shared it at an earlier stage, but it was very often a matter of digging around and finding it. I mean, if you like, physically in the back of someone's drawer, but quite often, you know, in a remote folder in someone's laptop. So it is about those respective responsibilities What is it that you, O school, you must do, and what is that we, the local authority, must do? We did very much go about it by bringing together different agencies and different interest groups locally to have the discussion. The development did run over quite a long period, but I think in every case the local authority decided to run, as it were, they didn't call it a trial version, but they developed a version that they were going to run for a year and then take feedback, which I think was a sensible approach. And then I have added into my final slide some examples here. I would encourage you, though, not to click on those links until I've done a double check that they are the most up-to-date links available. So, Anna, that I think is me done. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks. We do have a few minutes. Oh, I can hear myself. That's strange. Just mute yourself. Lovely, thank you. Yeah, we do have a few minutes for some questions or reflections, anything that Philippa has said. So do come off mute and speak up, or write in the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat if anyone wants to write there. Stunned into silence. Oh, Sam's typing, I can see. And someone else. Really helpful. Yeah, I found that helpful too, Philippa. Thank you. Okay, well, maybe we'll go off onto Julia's presentation now, and you can hold on any thoughts or questions for after that. So I am going to share my screen, Julia, so that everyone can see your slides.
Lovely, thank you, Anna.
Oh, that's not what I want to share. Oh dear, Philippa's worked beautifully. Daphne, could I ask you a favour? And
do you want me to share it on my screen?
If you've got them there, that would be great.
Yeah,
I can see them, but it's not showing me when I try to share. So
yeah, hopefully this will work. Let me know when you can see those.
Yes, that's great. Lovely, thank you.
Right, so let me just. Is that okay? Can you see that?
Yes, we can. That's great.
Wonderful. Right. So I'm Julia Katherine. I'm Head of Inclusion at Portsmouth Local Authority. And the branding there on that title slide is the branding for our local offer website. So that's the same branding that we've brought through in terms of our ordinarily available provision guidance. And I think Philippa's set out really well the requirements in terms of ordinarily available provision. So I won't go through any of that because that just repeats what we've heard already. Have the slides moved on? Just want to check that it's working properly.
Yes.
Wonderful. Right. So I'm going to share with you the process that we went through originally when we set up our ordinarily available provision, and then what we've done slightly more recently. So back in 2014, in preparation for the implementation of the Children and Families Act and the SEND reforms, we'd got a number of SENCOs who we'd seconded to work with us to prepare us and schools for the implementation of the Act. So we'd got a number of primary and secondary SENCOs, and one of the tasks that we asked them to work on was to develop some support for schools in terms of the expectations on schools. And it's important to say, I think, in terms of context, that in Portsmouth, the majority of our schools are academies. So we don't tend to differentiate between maintained schools and academies. So this was about guidance for all schools. So this piece of work, the Senkos identified the range of provision that schools said that they currently offered. So that included specific packages, resources, and evidence-based interventions. So what it ended up becoming, it just grew and grew, I guess, over the period of time, into a massive document, or as you can see, 11 documents, 16 appendices. We couldn't very easily email it. We had to zip it before we shared it. And it was a really useful but absolutely massive kind of library of resources for Senkos. So very useful for Senkos, but not particularly accessible for anyone else. And what we published on the local offer at the time was a summary of the key information that was in that document. But we weren't able to make the whole document available because it was just too unwieldy really for that purpose. So it was a working document for Senkos. That was really how it worked. In 2017, we decided that we needed to review and update that guidance. So again, working with a range of Senkos, we first of all had a look at what other local authorities were doing, because we're all tend to be working on the same issues, don't we? So it's really good to find examples of good practice elsewhere that we can kind of build on. We were very impressed with the Norfolk version, and we've acknowledged them and based some of our approach on the approach they had taken at the time. And we set up a task and finish group to co-produce this updated guidance. So what we were trying to do is take a slightly different approach. We wanted something that was going to be more accessible rather than being this library, this resource library. And the aim really was to achieve some consistency in our expectations across schools and settings, and some clarity in order to inform decision making. And Philippa's described already really clearly about the link between both ordinarily available provision guidance and high needs funding, which I'll come back to a bit later, and also in establishing that threshold for decision making, for example, when to go ahead with an EHC needs assessment. We're really proud in Portsmouth of our record on co-production, and we try and work in co-production wherever possible across all areas of our work. And we evaluate ourselves. So each project that we do, we evaluate it in terms of the co-production ladder with those that we've worked on, so with parents often, to look at how close we were to that goal of co-production. So in this particular case, we absolutely co-produced it with all of the Senkos in the city. And we've got a very well-established Senko network and engagement across the board, 100% engagement from all of our schools and settings with that. So we had the involvement of all of our Senkos in co-production. But also we worked really closely with parents and carers in terms of the design, the accessibility, the language, the look of it, because it was really important that we came up with something that was going to be useful for families, for parents and carers, as well as for professionals. And then what I'd say with head teachers is that we probably achieved engagement with head teachers, which was that they all saw it in various different iterations and had the opportunity to contribute to it. And again, it was really important that we kept heads on board with whatever we published, because we were a little anxious that if we published something that was very ambitious, that wouldn't go down with heads and that they might get a bit nervous about kind of the potentially open themselves up to challenge. So this is what we have now published as our updated ordinarily available provision guidance. It's on our local offer website. You can have a look at it, you can download it for free. I'm just going to pick out a couple of bits and pieces to share with you today, just to give you a flavour of what's in it. And as you can see, the audience there, it's aimed at both professionals and parents and carers. So very much with that audience, that joint audience in mind. In Portsmouth, again, we're really proud of our needs-led approach. So we try and take a needs-led approach to everything we do. We don't want to be providing support on the basis of a diagnosis, for example. We want to make sure that we're responding to the child's needs. So that means putting in support at the earliest opportunity, depending on the child's assessed needs, taking that plan, do, review approach. And this this document very much fits in with that approach. So here's a couple of bits from inside the guidance then. So section 1 sets out the expectations of all settings. And I have to say, in approaching this, we originally worked with school SENCOs, so it was aimed at school age children. We were going to do an early years version and a post-16 version, but actually when we looked at it again, most of what's in here is applicable right across the board. We're just in the process of finalising an early years version now, but actually a lot of this works just as well in colleges, FE colleges, as it does for schools. So expectations of all settings. So for example, this sets out the kind of assess, plan, do, review approach that we expect all of our education settings to take. It gives examples of adapting resources, using evidence-based interventions, and again, not waiting for that either diagnosis or for an EHCP for any of these to be put in place, but putting the support in as early as possible. Just going on, this is in the same section, so this is expectations of all settings again, and this is just taking one of the sections, so the physical and sensory environment. So for example, left and right-handed pupils are able to use equipment comfortably would be one of the examples there. Use of pale background and accessible font styles on the whiteboard. So again, things that we would expect to be widely in place that would benefit many children in settings. The second part of the guidance then, section 2, looks at each of the broad areas of need set out in the Code of Practice, and looks at some of the specific approaches and strategies that might be helpful. So in this case, communication and interaction, and we've got here approaches and strategies, resources, advice and consultation available. And then we've gone through and identified the key barriers for each of these areas of need and what some of the provision strategies or approaches might be that might help overcome that particular barrier to learning. So you'll see here in terms of the so approaches and strategies, whole school awareness in terms of communication and interaction would be one of those. On the right hand side, the resources that are available, those are obviously specific to Portsmouth. Whilst we're really happy for this to be used, there are some aspects of this that are only available locally. So each local area obviously has to co-produce their own kind of version of this. And then identifying barriers. So this is just the first page of this section, but the particular barrier here, difficulty saying what they want and being understood. And then a whole list of a bullet point list of some of the strategies and approaches that might be helpful to overcome that particular barrier. Moving on to cognition and learning. So again, just the first little bit of this section, the same approach. So we've got approaches and strategies, we've got resources, advice and consultation, and then underneath we've got identified barriers and some of the strategies that might help to overcome those barriers. So for example, in terms of this one, cognition and learning, we've got visual timetables, social stories, being some of the approaches identified to overcome that particular barrier. Moving on again, so there's a whole range of barriers identified and then strategies for each of those. This is the first bit of the section about social, emotional and mental health difficulties. So again, a whole list of approaches and strategies and resources that are available. I won't go through this in too much detail. This is just to kind of give you an idea of the approach that we've taken. And then here we've got sensory or physical needs, and again the same approaches and strategies, resources, barriers, and then possible ways of overcoming those barriers. So in terms of how it's used, I think the most important thing to say is that this is just one guidance document. So we don't see this as the totality of the guidance. This is just one particular document for a particular purpose, as I mentioned earlier. So alongside this, we do have a profile of need, which sets out in much more detail the areas of need, and enables us to kind of to score those to help with decision making as well in our various panels. We do have descriptors for our bands of funding, and we do have SEN support plans for schools. So if they're building up evidence of that plan, do review and intervention over time, we've got a support plan that they can use to kind of demonstrate that. So this document is just one, I guess, of a suite of documents that support schools. But what we found in terms of the impact of this is that it's the basis for everything. So anything else that happens starts with looking at what would be ordinarily available. So it enables much more informed conversations. I think it empowers parents and carers to have those informed conversations with their school or setting, with other professionals, about the child's needs, the support that needs to be in place, and then what would be reasonable to expect a school to deliver from their SEN delegated funding, from their ordinarily available resources. The feedback that we got from our parents and carers has been really positive. And actually this document is used by both the Parent Carer Forum and our local IAS service to kind of help inform some of the discussions they have with calls into them from parents. So it's really enabled that more empowered, informed conversation between parents, carers and professionals. It focuses on and really emphasises our ambition to become an even more inclusive city. So we think we've got a pretty good record on inclusion, but we know we can go further. So it really reinforces that graduated response, getting it right for all children, concentrating on what can be put in place, rather than thinking that the end goal is always to achieve an EHCP, for example, looking at actually how can we support the child with our delegated resources. It does enable more robust decision making, because you can make sure that your decision, for example, about whether to go ahead with an EHC needs assessment is consistent between two schools, between two children attending different schools, because you're always going back to those clear expectations set out in the guidance about what could be put in place to support the child without the need for additional funding. So there's greater consistency between schools. As I say, we've got sign up from all of our schools for this guidance, and everybody uses it. So heads make reference to it as well as SENCOs, and as well as professionals from other agencies. So you know, professionals from health services will refer to the Ordinarily Available Provision guidance as well. It's been a really helpful tool in enabling those discussions across agencies. Clear expectations of what good looks like. So it's not a tick list. We wouldn't expect every single school to put in place all of those strategies at the same time. There wouldn't be enough hours in the day, but it does show how you can take a tailored, a targeted approach and the range of strategies that it would be possible to put in place if the child needed that particular approach. Of course, as I said earlier, it does link to the high needs block funding. So yes, I mean, Philippa said earlier about making sure that the schools forum are aware of this approach. And yes, we do talk about ordinarily available provision. It's kind of changed the language. So this has now become a phrase that is widely used by a range of people. So lots of people refer to ordinarily available, meaning what's set out in this particular guidance. And that means you can be really clear when you would need additional funding, and when the support you're talking about can be provided from delegated funding. So yes, in summary, it's changed the conversation. And I think that's really important. It's changed the language, it's become part of our language that we all use, and it's changed the sorts of conversations we have. So rather than saying, does this child need an EHCP, what we want people to be saying is, what are the child's needs? What support do they need? And then let's have a look at whether that can be provided within what we would expect to be ordinarily those are all of my slides. So let me stop sharing.
Thanks, Julia.
And then I guess it's questions.
Yeah, questions, any reflections from anyone? I've got an eye on the chat if anyone wants to put anything in there. Parents bit is great, Julie says. And I noticed that Penny also asked previously after Philippa spoke about anyone else having parent guides. So it's useful to know that that actually use Julie as a joint one document for both audiences.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We found this in quite a lot of our documents, that we originally thought that we needed to develop a professionals version and then a parents version. And actually, we often find that if we make it clear, make the language clear, and so that parents can understand it, then actually professionals really like it as well, because it's accessible to all. So I think sometimes you don't need a different approach. You just need to make sure it's kind of clear and accessible to everybody.
Sure. Lovely. Any other thoughts? Oh, someone's trying to find. All right. Well, we're actually way ahead of time, but why don't we take 5 minutes comfort break, and I will make sure that I can share slides, hopefully, for Nuala. So come back at, let's say, 2 to 3. That sound all right? Hi, I think Tiffany and Amy have just joined us. We're actually just taking a 5-minute comfort break, and then we're going to come back to hear from Nuala and Manchester. And we've recorded the previous presentation, so you'll still be able to get access to that another time. All right.
Fantastic. Thanks, Anna. Sorry, we had another meeting overrun, but
don't worry. I know how these things go. You're very welcome. Yeah, so 5 minutes, we'll be back and hear from Manchester.
Lovely. Thanks, Anna. Bye.
Okay, hopefully that was long enough for a cup of tea, stretch your legs. I can definitely share slides. I've checked, so I will do that, Nuala. You don't have to worry about that. Hopefully, yep, you're there. That's great.
Thank you. Yep.
I'll share slides. Just give me a heads up when you want me to move on, and let's just get started. Hopefully, everyone else is back.
Okay, thank you.
I think Julia must have a much more up-to-date version of PowerPoint than I do, which is why I couldn't share. But we have the same, which is good. So, can you see that?
Yes, I can. That's brilliant.
Excellent.
That's really good. Okay, that's lovely. Thank you so much, everybody. My name's Nuala Finegan. I'm a Senior School Quality Assurance Officer for SEND in Manchester. And that basically means that I am part of the Quality Assurance team that oversees the provision for special educational needs and disabilities from 0 to 25. Massive piece of work, massive range of work. I don't pretend to have the answers to everything, but in this particular instance, early years is my background, and primary also is my background. So this is a perfect piece of work for me. So today I'm going to just talk through our approach to this piece of work under the very skilled support of Philippa and Chris from the CDC. Go through the Manchester context, our challenges, our strengths, our matching provision to need tool that we thought was wonderful and would answer all our questions and didn't. The action learning set, the piece of work that we did, the actual document that we came up with, our next steps and the benefits. And as Philippa says, very much planted firmly within the quality assurance and school improvement aspect of my work. So if you could just move on, please, Anna. So I'll talk about it. Oh, here we go. So Manchester context, we are proud to be an inclusive city. We have and have had for several years a disability plan, which, as you see there, it's the social model of disability, that it's socially constructed, and our role is to break down any barriers to anyone with a disability from joining in with regular activities. And in fact, ordinarily available provision has become our buzz phrase for the universe, if you like. We're a highly populated, densely populated, massive city with a high mobility. However, we have a huge population growth. I mean, it's something like over 97,000 more people living in the city than 5 years ago. So it's massive. So although people are moving in and out, vast majority of people who come stay. Many of them have children who need school places. So we do have 100 or more arriving in the city over the summer, needing a school place for the September. There's an impact. High levels of deprivation, more impact and more duress on our safeguarding. Increased numbers of those children needing early years provisions, and we are lucky in Manchester that many, if not most or all of our schools provide nursery provision. We have different qualities of provision. That's a challenge. So our schools have nurseries 3 to 5. We have private providers that offer provision from 0 to 5 or 0 to 3, depending on what you're looking at. Slightly different quality across those provisions, different expectations across provisions. What is inclusion in one setting? What does that look like compared to inclusion in another setting? And in fact, inclusion between school nurseries and earliest settings, there is a difference of expectation there. I'll just say the phrase school readiness. I'm sure some of you will recognise that may be different in different provisions. But we're also supporting children and families with multiple needs. And when we talk about complex families, it's not solely that they have a family with a child with additional needs. They may be a family that have experienced trauma. They may be a family with a substance or gambling addiction, with mental health issues. They may have had a bereavement. They may be refugees. And having a child with an additional need is only one element that makes up that family. So we're not just talking about in a funnel that we're looking at additional needs solely and singly. We're looking at the whole family and what other needs they may have. Thanks, Anna. So our strengths, I won't read them out, as Anna said, these will all be shared with you, but we have a whole rake of things to support early years settings, and our landscape is improving in the early years. Before lockdown, we had like 96% or more of our early years settings, that's our private providers, voluntary sector, that were good to outstanding, which is fantastic, given that it's sometimes much maligned sector of provision. But our settings are working really well, and it's because of the amount of support. As you can see there, there's a whole rake of teams, early help, early quality assurance team. We have a send pathway, lots and lots of quality people to support and who train and make sure that settings have what they need to make improvements. And our fabulous matching provision to need tool, I will talk about that in a minute. Can you have the next page, please? We have built up the teams and services around early years. We have multi-agency cohesive workings. We all work together. Co-production charter, we have it in writing that we work alongside and with parents to create. In fact, before that, to decide what we need as a city. They are our strategic partners. We have health working alongside us in their various agencies. And there you have links to our parent websites and parents groups. So we had all these strengths, all these wonderful things going on, lots of people helping out in our early years PVI sector, private, voluntary and independent sector. And yet we found that we would still come up against parents who would say that setting or that school can't meet need. In order for that school to take my child in, they need to have a plan. I hope this isn't unfamiliar to you all. And that was a real issue for us. Before we started this action learning set, we didn't really know what we were to do about that. Can we move on, please, Anna? We weren't really very sure what to do with it, because we had this matching provision to need tool. As it says, it's a means to support identification of primary need. It's not an assessment tool, but it's for settings and schools to look at what the need is and to see whether or not this child was in need of additional support, additional funding, and ultimately a plan. And in fact, that's how it has been used by our schools and our earlier settings, is in that decision making about whether or not to go through with a statutory assessment. If we had this in place, why was it that we were still lacking inclusion in some of our settings? And why was there a difference between our earlier settings being increasingly inclusive, increasingly displaying good practice, and some of our schools not doing so? Our schools saying that child needs to go back to their early years provider because we can't meet need. They need to have a plan or more funding. What was the gap? Could you move on, please, Anna? Now, this is just an example of our matching provision to need tool. The link is there for you to have a little look at what we have. And as you can see, it's what is typical development, indicators that give cause for concern, significant indicators. What's not to like? How fabulous is that? We have it all padded out. We've got a 0 to 5 version, we have a primary version, we have a post-16 version. Philippa was very, very diplomatic in saying to us, okay, do you have something that describes the support at each of these levels, or what you would expect to see? And of course, that's where our journey for our action learning set started. In early years, how can we expect there not to be a gap if we as a local authority, professionals and indeed parents have not given our expectations with any clarity, if we've not outlined what we expect to see as inclusive practice? So that was the start of our journey. We decided we needed to develop a document alongside the matching provisions need tool that said, okay, they may be here, these may be causes for concern, but this is what you do about it. And this is good practice. We decided to start with all those settings that we knew took children in with additional needs who may or may not have had an identified need, and actually don't make a big deal out of it. They just do it, and they work with us. They make phone calls. What else do I need to do? How should I do this? This is what we've been doing so far. So this gave us an opportunity to capture that good practice, to crystallize what it means to have good practice. What does that look like? What should you be doing? And this is before you ask for extra funding, or before you even have a plan. I mean, when I started in early years, many years ago, a now and next board was very niche. A traffic lights, very niche. You wouldn't do it. A timetable, visual timetable, it was very niche, very specialist. But we've discovered from our good practice in our earlier settings that actually that is now absorbed into good practice, and we took that as our starting point. It can be done. What we just have to do is spread the word and say, if these settings can do it, everybody can do it. It doesn't cost anything to have good practice. What do our parents want when they take their child to an earlier setting, be it independent or a school setting? Is it any different from what any other parent wants? Is it any different from what any other child wants? And we decided it's a resounding no. Good teaching is good teaching. Good practice is good practice, and it's inclusive. If we can just move on, please. I feel myself getting on a soapbox. I get a bit excited by this. So, of course, Philippa came to help us. Chris came to help us. We've done that. If we could move on a little bit, please. We brought together a huge range of professionals. In my own capacity as an ex-head teacher from an early years assessment provision, I had very good links with educational psychologists, with health visitors, outreach services. We even pulled in the commissioners, early years commissioners. They made very good points about the fact that private providers are businesses. There is a financial driver to what they are doing, and yet we had very good examples of where private providers had created provision that was highly inclusive. So we were able to use some very good examples to say that this is how it should be. We decided on an age range because the whole 0 to 5 would have taken us a million years, I'm sure, because we all had so much to say about it. It was quite clear in feedback from our parents and earlier settings that 22 to 36 months is the time where more children go to settings, and that's where particular issues are identified or first noticed. So we narrowed it down. We thought that's where we're going to look at. We met as a whole group. We and then broke down into working parties. What does good practice look like? And each of those small working parties, so the speech language therapists were a bit of a working party, the EPs and so on, came back to us and said, this is what we think in our particular area it looks like. That, as you can imagine, was massive. Can we move on, please, Anna? Everybody had their bit to say. Our little buzzword all the way through was, what would parents say to us? What would parents make of this? Do you understand what we're talking about? Do you understand the language you use? We identified a need to share this document at a very early stage. We'd already decided, I mean, I have to say, we looked at Portsmouth, we looked at Gloucestershire, we looked at many other local offers, and we were so in a spin about what was right for us that we decided that we would align it closely with the SEND Code of Practice and Development Matters, which I know will change for September 21. We took primary need, so we had sections of primary need, cognition and cognition and learning, communication, interaction, and so on. We wrote what we thought we needed to write, and then we shared it. So we need feedback on this. Are we going the right direction? We sent it out to Senkos. We had NASENCO training going on, so we had a captive audience. Those Senkos and indeed parents' workshops just told us very honestly where we've been going wrong, what they did and didn't understand, and sent it back to us. That changed the shape of the whole document. We had a better understanding. We added a resource section. We added introductions so that we as a local authority and body of professionals and parents could say, this is our approach. This is what we expect as a baseline from all our settings. This is what it means for communication interaction. It doesn't matter that children cannot speak or verbalise. Communication is wider than just speaking. So we rewrote, we reframed it, we reshaped it. And as the Manchester Parent Care and Forum tag is there, again, because parents were very, very on board with this piece of work, and they told us when it worked and when it didn't. Can we have the next slide, please? Discussion. As you can imagine, a lot of professionals around the table, and even in working parties, lots of discussion. What indicators to look for and what strategies to implement. There was a great deal of discussion about children who arrive at school with identified needs. Is this document for those children, or is this document about identifying needs? We decided that it was for all children. Good practice around when admitting children who have needs. The good practice is that you will follow whatever support plan those children have in place. They may not have an education, health and care plan, but they will have a clearly written out support from whoever that might be, sensory support service, the physiotherapist, occupational therapist. So we included that. That was a massive jump for us. The aim of the document was that we were describing the expectations at the universal offer. This isn't about gaining extra funding. This isn't about having a plan. This is about doing the best and giving the best as professionals, that your workers have a wide understanding of what their role is. And when you're only 0 to 5, wherever you are on that path, somewhere in the 0 to 5 framework, your early years framework, there will be an element that will suit all children. So that was our aim. I think I'm going to show you a sample now. There's a link there to the actual Ordinarily Available Provision. It's probably the old version. I'm working on an updated version at the moment. But can we have the next page? I think we've got a sample now. So this is physical and medical. So this is the introduction. So it talks about child development, having lots of opportunities to run, climb, jump before you can hone your fine motor skills. A little bit of research there, because we are professionals. We need to be able to back what we're saying up. But it does talk about things like adapted scissors, chunky pencils, talking about lots of encouragement. Children need to practice and practice and practice before you actually decide that there is an issue that needs more intervention. Can you have the next slide, please? So each section has an introduction, laying out our approach, and then the sample page, very simply, here's the stage of development. And we've been very clear at the beginning to say in our overall introduction that learning isn't linear, that our children learn in different ways, and we have to be open to that. They may lose skills before they learn more skills. But we've gone for a very simple, very accessible approach. What do you see? What do you do? And here are the resources to help you make that happen. Now, I've only given you the top of the page. I think we've got 2 or 3 more pages just on this section. I have to say that we lost the physiotherapists and occupational therapists quite early on in the discussion, because they only intervene following a referral. And we had lots of discussions about referrals. What does assessment mean? What does a referral mean? Do you just mean a phone call? Is it official? But when we had written these first 2 columns, we felt able to send this then to our physios and our occupational therapists and the sensory support service and say, this is what we've done. Can you support us in the resources that would support good practice? So we had the involvement of a whole range of professionals, even those who are very clear about referrals, and referrals being official, which I suppose strictly speaking is targeted. We haven't got to targeted yet. We wanted to get universal in place first. Can we have the next page, please? So we have the working document that was shared even in these COVID days. It was shared in September. Now the distribution is important. We sent it to all the Sencos that we knew about. That's the private providers, voluntary sector and our school Sencos. We sent it to all the head teachers of our primary schools. We sent it to the statutory assessment team who work on education, health and care plans and the statutory assessment process and who write plans. We've shared it with the early help team and our social workers so that everybody is clear about what Manchester Local Authority, what its professionals, what its parents expect as a universal offer. We are very clear as we were as we worked through it, we are now, that transition kept coming up, that gap between our very inclusive early years providers and the school nurseries who said they're not school ready, they are not where we expect them to be, therefore they cannot come to us without a plan or without more funding. We knew that there was a piece of work to do around transition because it kept coming up again and again. That is the focus of our current action learning set. So that is something that we will add onto this document. We are going to include a section on working with parents and carers, written by parents and carers alongside our early years outreach team. And in future, we're going to provide a targeted section. We're thinking about a specialist section, but I'm not sure we'll need it because by then, I think what we will do is work on an ordinarily available provision for our primary provision in a way that Portsmouth has done. Very much in the air at the moment, but we've got lots to do. Just the review and refinement of the document, we had some fabulous feedback from parents, really good feedback from early years providers, and also our speech and language therapists. I'm now working on adding a little bit about bilingualism because many of our families have 1, 2, 3 additional languages. And sometimes that has an impact, and sometimes we've discovered that can be misdiagnosed as a speech or communication difficulty. So we're adding some quality information into the review and update as we go along. The benefits, can we have the final slide, please? The benefits of this work is that we have been able to acknowledge the good practice already in place and acknowledge that on a public stage. Our early years peer review said that there's a lot of good practice going on in pockets around the city, but nowhere to celebrate it or nowhere to share it. So that is another reason we've written this document. The right people were involved all the way through. And as I said, people came in and dropped out depending on the need or where we were up to. But it was overseen at the end by all professionals and parents to make sure that we hadn't missed anything out. We know it's not perfect, but we needed to get it out so people could work with it and then give us feedback on the working of the document. We knew and we learned that we needed more interactions, more collaborative works across agencies. And we recognised the benefits of working with parents alongside them. They told us what they needed. We listened to them and they were able to tell us when it wasn't right and when it was right. And we're very proud. I mean, just a final thing about the benefit. Language was a massive piece of work for us. What does sensory mean? We know that there's many children with autism have sensory impairment, but actually it's quite a specific term around sensory difficulty, vision difficulty, hearing impairment. And so we had to be really clear and clarify our terms all the way through, which I think has led to better understanding across all agencies about what we all do, better understanding for parents about what we all do and what language we use pertaining to their children. A little word about that. Feedback from one school was, are we going to make a parent version? Well, we're not, because this is the local authority's expectation of what provision should be available. that is regardless of what parenting goes on in the city. If people want to provide parenting courses, great. If people want to support parents, and many of our settings do, that's brilliant. But this is our way of saying, this is what provision needs to look like in Manchester. This is how we're going to work towards an inclusive city. If we get it right in the early years, if we can get it right at transition into schools, then I think we will get it right throughout primary and then throughout secondary. Massive ambition, I know, I'm probably mad, but if you don't aim high, we'll never get there. And I'm going to stop now. I think I've talked for 20 minutes. Thank you very much, everybody.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Nuala. That was really interesting. We're going to pop you into breakout groups just for 10 minutes to have a bit of discussion, a smaller session. But does anyone have any reflections or questions for Nuala while we're still in the main session? I thought it was fascinating, the work that the detailed work that you did with therapists that brought that different, the nuances that you captured there was really interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, I wonder if we're in a smaller group, we might get a chance to have a bit of discussion. Philippa, you were going to just give us a couple of prompts.
Yes, thanks, Anna, and thanks, Nuala. And I know Julia, Katherine had to leave, but thanks to both of you for the sort of insights and particularly the sort of insights into the Portsmouth approach, which is a longer established approach, but the lovely insights that Nuala's given us into the sort of development of the approach in Manchester, which I think will probably be helpful to the discussion in the groups. So what I'd ask people to do, my instinct is that the best approach is to in the small groups just have an initial sharing of information about what have you got in place already, what's there, is it a live document agreed with everyone that is subject to now some kind of review process. If it's not, where is it, how well known is it, how well established is it, and what would you need to do to bring it into to a wider forum, a wider audience, and to secure wider sign up. And on top of all of that, how well used is it? Whatever the stage of development, whether only known to a small handful of people or widely known, how well used is it? Is it used to inform those decisions about EHC needs assessments and plans? Is it used to inform the provision that a child may need next if one thing didn't work? Is that document used to think about and have a discussion with parents, with other agencies about what's needed to be provided next? So take stock. Where are you now? How well known, how well used is your document? And in the light of that, what are the next steps? So take stock and next steps. Is that all right? Anna, is that clear enough for folk?
I think so. We'll see what happens in the groups. So we're using Teams breakout. So in a second, you're going to get an invite to join a room, and then I'll give you just a warning, a couple of minute warning before we're going to come back into the main group. So off and have some conversations. Okay, well, hopefully you got a chance to chat to some colleagues, listen to what happens in other areas, get some ideas, talk through some of the things you're thinking about specific to your local work. Would anyone like to just reflect on anything of the conversations you had? Philippa, Chris, I know you were in the other groups. Anything that you heard that you thought was shareable, you want to share?
Shall I pile in?
Lovely,
first?
yes, please.
Okay. So it was what was really interesting in the discussion that we had in our group. Colleagues from Kent and Warwickshire were there, and both are in the process of reviewing, revising and launching new documents. Kent have just launched theirs, and Warwickshire are just about to trial it. I think that's a reasonable reflection. Sarah will correct me, I hope. What's really interesting, though, is we had quite an interesting discussion about kind of next steps, apart from getting it out there and getting it discussed, embedded and up and running. We also had some discussions about training in relation to what's expected in all schools, and, if you like, some of the extent to which expectations might change over time, but also who might actually fund that training. Is that going to be something that the local authority is going to fund in order to try and bring people up to a particular level of provision, or is it something that actually schools would be expected to use their delegated budget for? So that was quite interesting, and there may be a little bit of sort of, if you like, pump priming or loss leader, or you know, introduction of new expectations that might be sought from the local authority to support this and give it a good start. The other thing that we just touched on towards the end of the discussion was really about how this document is pitched. Is this just universal, or is it targeted? And what do you mean by targeted? Because potentially schools have a slightly different view of targeted from the local authority. So targeted in school will be something that you might do for groups of children when there was a need, but seen from the outside of the school, that might be seen as universal. In other words, you would provide it, if you like, for any child who might need it. So I think there are some further discussions to be had about that, and probably to be had as the documents are trialled. But it was really interesting. I just want to thank colleagues from Kent and Warwickshire for you know, the terrific work that's gone on, and the way that they're carrying that forward in a really consultative way. Really impressive.
Excellent, thanks. Any thoughts? Anyone else want to echo anything Philippa said or add to it? Chris, how was your group discussion?
Hiya. We were just talking about the different stages people are at. You know, those, I mean, I think someone earlier said about I think it was Nuala said, there's no linear path to this stuff, but it's still, you know, where do people at in terms of bringing people together, or the different where things are at in terms of having to really a lot of work to do on a guide, or a guide that's nearly ready to go or just about gone out, but actually is, you know, testing the implementation of it, and, you know, that engagement of, you know, the best ways of engaging other professionals, and making sure there's so many voices that, you know, so many opinions that need to be part of this process, you know, the ways of bringing all of those together, you know, not necessarily at the same time, but at different stages. One, you know, that's some of the general stuff. One of the interesting things came up with one of the people in our group was around where the local areas where there's cross-border issues. So if you know, it's a challenge enough keeping things consistent in your local area, but if you've got children who are very close to a border and coming in, it's how do you manage, you know, the support is reasonable and fair and done properly with that kind of thing at play.
Thanks. One of the so the group I was listening, and anyone do chip in if you want to add anything to what I say, but we had a couple of interesting discussions, particularly around how this document, how as a resource can be used with our, well, CAMS was the specific example, who might be unaware of the, you know, approach of trialing things before a statutory request is made, and how actually a really thorough, complete document can really educate our colleagues from other areas who might not understand what could be tried in the school, and how that kind of helps, I guess, make sure that any statutory requests that come in are completely evidence-based and have a complete picture of a child's needs and what's happened with them up till then. And a really interesting discussion, I don't think, well, I certainly don't have an answer for it, it's just one to ponder on it. Philippa, might be one for you. Thinking about tribunals and how ordinarily available provision as a tool, how that stands, you know, where that fits in the tribunal process, and how colleagues can use that document to support their work. And I mean, obviously, ultimately, we wouldn't want to get to tribunal, but how can we use this resource at those early stages to try and tease out some of the issues that might arise, and if the tribunal does get to that stage, how what that means, I suppose. So it's certainly not something I had an answer to, but something that I think everyone agreed was a point to think more about. Any other thoughts? We're almost at the end of our time, so last chance, Philippa. Yeah.
Could I just bring together a few threads from I think are really, really interesting. I think there are just a few things that I think we really need to check. The first bit is really reflecting on what Nuala said about, how we went in asking awkward questions. I think we need to be confident that the document that we have does the job that we want it to do. Does it really talk about the specifics of the provision we expect to be in place? I think that's the first thing. And I'm not suggesting that's a problem, but I do think that many of the documents we saw, some time ago in the very early stages of the reforms, when this was all, a new ray of light was shed on this particular area of activity, if you like, was that there was quite often a very careful differentiation of levels of need. And I think that isn't helpful, because actually the way that you determine the level of need is through making provision and seeing whether that met need. And that's your first step, if you like, in identifying need, is did what we did it work? Did what we did work? And I think that's, if you like, that's the first question. And if it didn't, what do we need to do that's either different or additional? And then working your way through a kind of decision tree, if you like. But I think so we've got to make sure that the document we've developed actually does the job that it needs to do. The second thing is that everyone recognises that this takes time to develop this document, and the discussion and consultation that needs to go on. And whether or not you have someone who is able to lead this work, it cannot be done by one person sitting in a room on their own. It has to be done through engagement with, as a number of people have said, with different agencies, but also with schools, with parents, and with a range of more specialist support as well, to determine what is reasonable for mainstream settings to do. The next thing I think is that the support to embedding it across schools is probably quite an important consideration. Do we set our targets high, and then we have to provide some support to schools to achieve this? Or are we setting it at a lower base, in which case do we actually undermine things that some schools might be doing, which actually go beyond what that low baseline is? So is another consideration. So pitching it somewhere in the middle is probably quite good, so you can be confident that you've got a number of schools who can deliver on most of what's here. But the other thing is, I don't think anyone should ever regard this document as being their final version. I mean, most people talked about sort of draft versions, or going to trial this for a while and so on. But if it's ever seen as being a finished document, I think we've probably failed, because I think it does have to be kept constantly under review and constantly brought back to people's attention. And I think that was the thing that we found when we were working with early years colleagues in local authorities, that actually quite often a piece of work had been done at an earlier stage, but it kind of got a bit of dust on it and needed the dust blowing off it. But I think it needs to be kept dust free, if you like, so brought back to people to check it. Does this still work, or do we need to review and revise it again? And again, are all parties involved? Have we had a turnover of staff, which means that we've got a reducing number of people who are aware of it? But it's just a few thoughts, just on the basis of some of the work that we've been doing recently. So there seem to me to be important features of this work.
Lovely, thanks, Philippa. Helpful as ever. Okay, well, like I said at the start, we recorded the presentation, so we'll make sure that that comes to you as a package, or you can share it with anyone that wasn't able to join, or if you missed the start. We're also going to share slides once we've got final versions of those. And thinking about a bit of work going forward. So this was aimed at our send leads, and I know we've got some different people here too, but there might be some more resource that we can do a similar session on a different topic. So if you've got any ideas about what you might find helpful, do let me know. And just thanks to Philippa and Nuala and Julia, Katherine, who I know isn't on the call anymore, but I'll make sure we extend our thanks by email. So yes, if that's all, then thank you and have a nice rest of the day. Daphne shared a survey link, so please do fill that in just so we can report back to DFE, and we'll see you all shortly. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.